Welcome to the Bill Walton Show, featuring conversations with leaders, entrepreneurs, artists, and thinkers. Fresh perspectives on money, culture, politics, and human flourishing. Interesting people, interesting things.
We're here today to talk about Erik Prince's recent paper entitled Too Big to Win, how the military and industrial complex and the Neocons keep America losing. Some of the quotes from this that I think tell you what this is about is that the current policy model of the U.S. security assistance is broken and counterproductive. The U.S. military is the most expensive military organization in 3,000 years of human history and has degenerated into an instrument for selling or grifting overpriced military hardware to countries that struggle to use it, let alone maintain it. And here at home, and this is something I deeply agree with, which is America continues to wage futile, forever wars of convenience because Washington believes we are immune to reality and evolve beyond history. Lot to get into here. And to get into it, I'm back here also with Dr. Stephen Bryen, who's been a guest on the show. I don't know, we've talked some 6 or 7 times on various topics.
Yeah. Right.
And Stephen's a formidable expert in military expertise, defense, strategy. Morley Safer, if you remember him, of 60 Minutes, said Dr. Bryen was the Pentagon's top cop, the man whose job it was to ensure that sensitive technology would be kept from enemies, potential enemies, and questionable allies. And also, Eileen Shannon of Time magazine said, Stephen Bryen is the Yoda of the arms trade. He was formerly Defense Department's export czar. He knows every sinkhole in the regulatory swamp. Ignore him at your peril. Well, I've been looking forward to this conversation for a while to have Erik and Stephen talk about the issues. And today we want to cover sort of where our defense, what our defense looks like today, what it should be, what's wrong with it, where we can go from here, and dig into a lot of the details about all this. Erik, why don't you just start us out with why you wrote this and what we're going to do about it?
I wrote it off the top of my head, I guess out of frustration at the just continued losing policies that we've been stumbling upon for the last 30-ish years, ranging from really missing the opportunity to engage positively with Russia after the Soviet Union collapsed, to continuing to push NATO, which is not really it's not an alliance, it's a protectorate. And so we've pushed and pushed and pushed and pushed that border of NATO right up against the Russians, and they have serious security concerns about that, to how the entire GWOT, Global War on Terror, was fought, now represents, that defense spending since 2001 represents about a third, almost 40% of our debt. And what have we gotten for it? We replaced the Taliban after 20 years with the Taliban. And in Iraq, we basically turned it over to the Iranians, to Iranian subversion. And I guess in my unique career path, I was at many of those pivotal moments that if the sliding door moment, that if a decision was made in a better way, we'd be in a lot different place today as a country.
Well, you know, when I started the show, I sort of buried the lead. Erik happened to have a little job he founded, Blackwater, a private security company that was integral to what we're doing in Iraq. He was a former Navy SEAL officer and now has a private equity firm and also is still engaged in private military contracting around the world. And you're still quite active in all the
Still pay attention.
You're still paying attention as a man on the field. So that's an interesting place to be. Stephen, what's your take on where his?
Well, I completely agree on the Russian thing. I think that we had a great opportunity with the collapse of the Soviet Union, something I worked hard on in my way in the Pentagon.
You helped it collapse.
I did. And I did happily do that. But it also opened up the possibility of working out deals with the Russians that could have been very progressive, I think is the best way to put it, and taken the pressure off of Europe and taken changed the whole strategic landscape. Let's put it that way. And at a time when we had a rising China, so that having a, not having two major adversaries would have been very much in our interest.
Who was behind? I mean, I was happily doing private equity, Wall Street stuff back then. I wasn't paying that much attention. It seemed like after the Cold War ended or the Soviets fell apart, we should have put our arms around Russia and did what we did with Germany and Japan. Really, after World War II, bring them in to the world.
There was talk about that, but then we did the reverse. We tried to infiltrate the Russians and to knock off the Yeltsin government and the subsequent government there. And then we sided with the Chechen revolutionaries, which was complete nuttiness on our part. Why would we do that? This was, if we were fighting terrorism, which we claim we were, then this would have been the perfect opportunity to find common cause with the Russians and to help them. They ended up dealing with it in a rather brutal way, to say the least. But I think we could have done much better, and we could have been helpful. We did the reverse.
Well, this was because of the military-industrial complex. We couldn't shut it down. We needed to keep the war machine going.
If the reason for NATO and the reason to spend that much in defense was the existential threat that the Soviet Union presented, well, then when the Soviet Union went away, when the Warsaw Pact withered, then why were we spending that much?
And a lot of people ask, why do we need NATO?
Exactly.
Yeah,
agree.
I mean, it doesn't have a role now. And instead we went, well, now's the time to expand NATO. So it was and there's this terrible litany of promises made to the Russians about we're not expanding. Starting with Clinton saying, oh, we're not expanding. And then, of course, doing the reverse. And I think the Russians had it up to here.
And I think Americans don't really, we watch our own World War II movies and think the United States Army defeated the Soviet or the Nazis. We lost 250,000 soldiers in the European theater in World War II. The Soviets lost 22 million.
Yeah.
While the U.S. was still messing around in North Africa, the Soviets lost 1.2 million soldiers at Stalingrad alone.
Yeah.
But they did that, and they erased 800,000 Germans from the German order of battle by order of magnitude. So just what really won, I would say, America's major contribution to winning World War II in Europe was our industry. And our industry is in a fraction of
and it
shape.
supported the Russians because the Lend-Lease program was primarily for Russia or Soviet Union.
600,000 trucks made it possible for Zhukov to go from Moscow all the way to Berlin in trucks, because the German army at that point was only about half mechanized, thus a lot of horses.
Yeah.
So we didn't, so many places to go with this, but after World War II, the Russians had lost 22 million people. Steve and I were talking before, we wouldn't have won the war without the Soviets.
It would have been a very different fight.
Now, I think that you can't rewrite history. It's impossible. But I think there would have been a lot of opposition to staying in the war if we were doing it by ourselves. It wouldn't have been the same atmosphere at all.
Was America ready to have 4 million casualties or 10? I don't think so.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that and we resisted it. Of course, the British resisted it too because they had memories of what happened to them in World War I and the terrible losses they took.
Yep.
So they didn't want to commit to an intervention, especially in France, within early. They didn't want to commit to it at all, in my opinion. They were pretty much forced into it by Roosevelt and by Stalin, who said, this is the way it's got to be. And the Russians were looking for us to pull off some of those Nazi divisions from the east to make it easier for the Russians to advance. And they claimed, and they were right, that they were paying the highest price.
Very much they were.
Yeah. But I think the war would have been a totally different affair altogether.
And I guess very germane to now, The high water, the last big attack of the Nazi army against the Soviets was at the Battle of Kursk,
That's right.
the biggest tank battle in history. 6,000 tanks, the summer of 1943. And in very much the same terrain that you're seeing the Russians fighting now against the Ukrainians.
Well, let's talk about tanks. I want to get back to NATO and why NATO was not why we needed NATO in 1991, and in particular, why do we need it now? But let's first dive into the really interesting subject of tanks.
Or whether they're still relevant.
That's my
I mean,
question. What do we?
Kursk was a very interesting battle because a huge number of tanks were destroyed in that battle, including a huge number of Russian tanks. It got so bad that the Russians were digging their tanks into revetments and using them as fixed artillery, because otherwise, if they put them out on the field, they were getting blown away. And this was maybe the last really great tank battle that ever took place.
Never say never.
Never say never, but it also showed that tanks, armor as such, you could use it to make a breakthrough, but you're going to pay a high price, a very high price. And now we're seeing today, fast forward, how many years is it? 75 years. Fast forward to today, and what we're seeing in Ukraine, which you mentioned, because Kursk is very near to Ukraine. It's not far away.
Just north.
Yeah.
We've put a tank on the battlefield that apparently now the administration has told the Ukrainians not to use them because they're going to be destroyed. Period, full stop.
Well, isn't that the bigger picture? What we learned from this adventure in Ukraine is a lot of stuff that we've been building we thought was going to be effective turned out to not be effective.
Well, like the German Leopard, which was supposed to be the great game changer, that turns out to be the great coffin.
And maybe it worked if your premise was only fighting against other tanks, but the enemy always gets a vote. And now, the first big strategic offset was supposed to be nuclear weapons back in the 50s and 60s, 70s. Right. And then precision weapons. And the U.S. had amazing precision weapons. You saw that in Gulf War I and in Gulf, 2003. Now everyone has precision weapons. And now you can take an FPV drone, a little kid's racing drone with 7-inch blades, take a beer can size 3D printed charge, put it on there, drive it into the back of the tank, right into the bustle. It's a vulnerable spot.
Right.
And for
what's a bustle?
It's the back,
the rear end of the tank.
The rear end of the tank turret.
Cute name for a tank.
It's the bustle of the tank turret. And you drive that FPV drone because it's super maneuverable, and you drive it right in and you clack it off, and now you've just taken out a tank. So the precision weapons are prolific now and cheap and available. And the Russian army is getting a lot smarter fighting. There is nothing like the cauldron of battle that will force people to be educated quickly. And two, all the high dollar American stuff is not in high demand because it doesn't work. You have a $200,000 Javelin missile made by Raytheon with a $300,000 control launcher unit. The Ukrainians can only fire that the first time, because the second time, once the first tank is burning, the next other Javelins guide themselves into the hottest burning tank. So the Ukrainians have to use a $30,000 Stugna missile made by them that does the same thing to hit tanks 2, 3, 4, and 5.
In other words, what's happening is the IR seeker is finding the hot spot.
Yes.
And what he's saying. And so it only sees hot spots. It doesn't have any brains. It goes after the hot spot.
So the jamming that the Russians are doing is very good, and it's blinding a lot of this super exotic American tech. And so we've had 20 years of fighting against guys in flip-flops, a relatively unsophisticated enemy. Now we're fighting, now
we have
U.S. tech
a real land war.
Yeah.
A real land war.
And the U.S. stuff is not doing well.
Well, first of all, the Abrams tank is too big, too heavy. It sinks in the mud. It gets stuck. The Ukrainians don't like it. The German tank is very hard to maintain, keep running, and it doesn't do the job. They've been knocking those off. So the whole question of, and with the FPV drones, the whole question is whether the tank has a future.
Well, let's talk about weapons development, because the thing that I first met Eric over 20 years ago. I was in the private equity business, and I thought Blackwater might be an interesting thing to invest in. And I somehow got a hold of one of your people, and they said, well, Eric will meet you at the airport. And I went out to Dulles and I was waiting at the fixed base operator, FBO, and there were all these interesting people sitting in the lobby in Saudi Arabian Army uniforms and South America and that sort of thing. And well, we're all going to go down to visit Blackwater. So we all get on the plane, twin engine. What kind of plane was that?
Probably a Casa.
Casa?
Yep.
And we're all sitting on the plane. I'm looking around for Erik Prince. Well, the pilot comes in, and that's Lieutenant Prince, and he gets in and he flies us down to Blackwater. It was an extraordinary day. And the thing that you were doing at the time was you were building an alternate vehicle, an all-terrain vehicle. I don't remember what it was, but it was vastly cheaper. It was better and more effective than what the Defense Department was creating.
Yeah, and we passed all the tests, all the explosive tests, and they wouldn't buy it because really it was an early lesson that Pentagon procurement is not about merit. It is about politics. And
It's always been true.
It's a Sovietization of what I thought was a market-based decision-making.
Well, I loved your business because it was, as private equity, you're always looking for niche companies that can do things better, faster, cheaper. But I said, I think we talked about it. So, Eric, your business has got a little political risk here because, because of all the good things you're doing in Iraq, it's easy to make Blackwater a political target, and that's exactly what ended up happening. Because I think you were making the Defense Department look bad.
Well, and worse than that, the big defense contractors don't want any competitor that's going to come in and mess up their very bloated pricing structure. Because we focused on doing firm fixed price contracts because we understood our costs.
That was a mistake. I mean,
What's that?
It was a mistake to try and sell something cheaper to the Pentagon.
I should have called Steve.
I would have told you that right off.
Call Yoda. Yoda will say.
That never works. I mean,
well, it did work. I mean, it worked for the taxpayer, but it didn't work for the
Pentagon didn't buy it.
Did they end up buying anything? Or?
The vehicle? No.
No. So, but why is it so broken, Steve? I mean, you can see the big defense contractors who are absolutely have every lobbyist on the planet to make sure that the budget ends up.
A brigade of lobbyists in Washington.
Well, and they have the support of the congressional committees and who
are paid by the lobbyists,
authorize and then appropriate the money, and then from a human point of view, the people who work in industry work in the Pentagon and vice versa. So it's a revolving chairs is what's called.
Yep.
So you have a system that's very tight, and it's very hard to introduce new ideas. And cheap is not one of those new ideas that they like.
Yeah, I mean, the idea of, and again, the cauldron of battlefield learning, adapting an FPV drone for $1,200-$1,500 a piece versus a $200,000-$300,000 missile system.
Right.
And again, the Russians are learning. And it used to be that if you shot at them with artillery or rockets, it would take them an hour and a half to shoot back. Now it's down to 2 minutes, 3 minutes.
Has the Ukraine, their experience in Ukraine's made them a lot better?
Absolutely.
Yeah. They also have copied us to some extent. I mean, they've learned a lot about how you integrate your forces, how you get your command and control straightened out, how you can handle multiple threats at the same time. And they've learned that from us pretty much. Of course, they apply their own approach to it, but we've seen that develop. In the first part of the war in Ukraine, they were terrible. I mean, they blundered all over the place.
Blundered, huge logistics problems, very, very vulnerable.
They got stuck on roads when they shouldn't have been on roads. I mean, they did just about everything wrong. And they paid a very high price for it.
I mentioned in the article that, again, offering a market-based solution that was historical, going back to Lend-Lease when the U.S. provided lots of stuff to the Brits or the Soviets fighting the Nazis.
Yeah.
There was 200 some aircraft that were already scheduled to be retired from the U.S. Air Force, including 50 F-15s, 50 F-16s, and I think 42 A-10s. Mm-hmm. All perfect for deterring Russian invasion. And Biden could have done two things. He could have announced, of course, Ukraine is never going to be part of NATO, but they're going to have an air force here, and flown those aircraft to Ukraine, put a Ukrainian roundel on them, let contractor pilots fly it for a year and a half until Ukrainian pilots are trained up, and done. 140 extra Western combat aircraft dispersed around Ukraine, well flown, would have chewed up any Russian ground force. And yes, they have a lot of missiles, fine, but
They have good air defense.
But if we had said, we're not going to push NATO on Ukraine into NATO, would that have shut this thing down?
I think so. And if you'd made Ukraine live to what the original Minsk agreement was,
that would have been a better idea. And that should
And
have
what
been,
was the original Minsk agreement?
well,
What
it had a
did
number
that
of
say?
provisions.
Because we're now going to start blaming all sorts of people when the Ukraine thing goes bust, probably just before the election.
I think the key provision, there were two. The key provision was about Donbass. And the key provision was that Donbass would become autonomous, but still would continue to function under Ukrainian law. And it would require the Ukrainian parliament to authorize that, which it would refuse to do. So they could have, instead of trading territory for peace, this would have been a much better solution because it wouldn't have changed the territorial boundaries other than Crimea, which would stay out and stay part of Russia. And then it turns out, interesting, this is very interesting business because the Russians kept saying, what about, we have Minsk 2, we had Minsk 1 and then Minsk 2, and we're willing to support that. And the Ukrainians said, no, we don't want to do it or whatever. But if you really look at what happened is that nobody in the West ever thought it was serious. Angela Merkel, who was then chancellor and subsequently said, well, we're just faking the Russians, we're just keeping them on the burner, so to speak. But we never were serious about this. We didn't want to do it. So there was nothing to negotiate at the end of the day. It was a shame because this whole war could have been avoided.
I'm beginning to think she was about as competent as Joe Biden. I mean,
I don't
she's
know,
also
given her
destroyed their energy
background, because
industry.
she
Yeah.
grew up in East Germany.
Yeah.
Given her background, I thought she'd have figured it out, but I guess she didn't.
and even worse, they're shutting down nuclear reactors, fully functioning ones, ahead of schedule
In Germany.
in Germany
Yeah.
to worship at the green altar.
I think they've done that.
Yeah, they did.
No, the last one's done.
Yeah.
They've shut them all down.
And now we're cutting off Russian uranium to run our reactors.
Yeah.
I mean, this is nutty.
So what? So
Which is exactly why the Russians are very active throughout the Sahel with Wagner Group to get control of more of the world's uranium supply.
talk about Wagner Group. Stephen and I talked about them early on. I mean, we were. I won't speak for Stephen, but I thought the Ukraine thing was a catastrophe from the very beginning, and that we should have done a lot of things to stop it, and we didn't do any of that. But
Right.
the Wagner Group, is that a private military contractor? Really?
It is a Russian private military contractor, yes, and it was first used in the seizure of Crimea and Donbass in 2014.
They were the little green men.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Now,
Little green men.
When they came in with
nameless
green uniforms, with
special
no
operations
patches,
soldiers.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
no identifiers.
The Russians pitched me in 2011. Now, this is, reset. Everyone was loving Russia. And I went to Moscow in 2011, and they said, please come and build a Blackwater capability here. We'll give you the land, we'll give you the facility, do something to employ our veterans in Russia.
And Blackwater capable facility. I mean,
No. So I'd sold the U.S. entity in 2010.
I know, but I just want to explain what you did. It was a massive training operation, among other things.
Yeah, we started as a training facility. It was the largest private weapons facility in the world.
Yeah.
It became 55 ranges, big track, big ramming pad, 5 shoot houses, 3 fighting cities. We trained between 800 and 1,000 people a day.
And a
Mostly
great
US
place,
military.
place to go due diligence on a deal.
And we were the largest private holder of weapons as well.
I remember that. Anyway, so continue with your
everything the left loves to hate.
But I just wanted to explain what it is you do.
And then the Russians said, please come and do that here.
Yeah.
And I obviously said, thank you, but I can't do that. And I left and had no further discussions. But they were looking for something which has appeared all through history, and that is private sector on the battlefield organizing resources to do the bidding of a state. And that's exactly what they did in Ukraine. It's exactly what they did in Syria, in Mozambique, in Central African Republic, in Libya, and now all through the Sahel, displacing. They just facilitated kicking the U.S. out of two very expensive brand new bases that we built in Niger out.
Yeah. Haven't we been kicked out of 5 countries in the last 3 or 4 years?
Yep.
So
that's our good African policy.
Well,
it worked.
But let's talk about the concept of private military contractors, because I think about Renaissance Italy. I mean, all these city-states had these independent contractors who go from state to state for work for the highest bidder, and but it still seems like a good idea to for my world of
well, it wasn't because it almost replaced the government of Russia. I mean,
Wagner did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow, that wasn't as serious after
Well, I think it was actually, but we could debate that. But I think it got out of hand. There's no doubt about that.
Look,
you guys don't have to agree.
We're near Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
Across the street from the White House is Lafayette Park. There's 4 statues: Lafayette, Rochambeau, Von Steuben, Kosciuszko. 2 Frenchmen, a Prussian, and a Pole. Kosciuszko, founder of American artillery. Von Steuben, first inspector general. The 2 Frenchmen, battlefield commanders. All 4 of those guys were foreigners that came and built the Continental Army. So those were mercenaries, contractors, whatever you want to call them. Mm-hmm. America before that, Jamestown, Massachusetts Bay, Plymouth colonies were companies started by companies listed on the London Stock Exchange. And they hired guys like Miles Standish or John Smith. You probably remember those names from childhood. Those guys were former professional soldiers that were hired by those companies to secure
territory,
those settlements.
Right.
So America was founded by companies with PMCs, not by the British Army, not by some crown representative.
Mm-hmm.
That's how America was founded. So this idea of the private sector appearing and doing difficult things in that space, it is the world's second oldest profession.
I'll let that one go. But let's just I'm a capital allocator. One of my core competencies is allocating capital, doing it prudently, getting a high return on it, not wasting capital, things like that. It seems like government does just the opposite. It seems like it just wastes capital with no regard for return or anything. And
what does that mean? Return on investment in the Pentagon?
Well, I was going to turn to you and say, Steve, explain yourself.
It's even
because how do we,
there's no cost consciousness in the sense that you or I would understand it.
Not just in the Pentagon, but any place in the government. But that's
it's the embodiment of socialism, where when you divorce cost from spending, you have no information, right? You allocate capital based on demand versus what something costs. In the Pentagon, what something costs. You ask a general what something costs, they have no idea. Ask any of the people actually deciding what it actually costs to fly a plane, to deploy 1,000 men, nobody thinks like that at all. At all. And that's the embodiment. That's what we were contesting in opposing the Soviet Union, was that paradigm of a kind of a pure Bolshevik socialism.
Well, we used to say when the Pentagon was the last great vestige of socialism in America.
Yeah, look, I went to Hillsdale College. I was an Austrian economics major, and my professor said, "Mr. Prince, you just graduated with an Austrian economics degree. Why are you going to serve in the largest socialist organization yet on the planet?"
Same thing. Yeah.
And I said, "Sir, it's at least provided for in the Constitution. It says Congress shall raise a navy."
And you were technically a Navy lieutenant, yeah, but even though the SEALs
but
were
I think it's
a little more.
It's a bigger problem because the idea that you have infinite resources to fight wars is a non-starter. In my opinion, it's a non-starter.
Absolutely.
And I think we're finding that the Ukraine thing we're finding that out pretty hard way, because the amount of, what do we have in there, about 150 billion dollars, something like that
So far?
so
No,
far.
hundreds.
There's
Been multiple tranches of 50, 60, 100
Yeah,
billion.
what you
So,
say,
so the
like-
headline number is 150, but the reality is probably double that.
yeah, we're more.
Sure, because they'll value something at what they gave them at
Yeah,
what he bought it for 20 years ago, and we're going to replace it at 5 times that value.
Precisely.
It's ugly.
Oh,
It's
my.
really ugly.
So,
So I mean, it's from that point of view, and the lack of performance, ought to open some eyes, or you would think, in Pentagon planning. Say, wait a minute, what have we got wrong here? I mean, look at air defenses. You mentioned airplanes, but also air defenses. We don't have any.
so I'm going to jump to
And
one
the
of my
Chinese just bought a
conclusions.
Patriot.
I was involved in the Trump transition overseeing financial agencies, and I've kept my hand in, who should be in what role in government. My favorite choice right now for the next defense secretary is this guy sitting here, because I think we need a radical rethink of how we allocate our military resources.
I would suggest he would never get through the confirmation process.
Well, I'll make him a special advisor. To the
Special
president.
advisor,
You
maybe,
can-
yes.
You can be. No, the confirmation would
But
be
I mean, the
highly entertaining.
look at the Houthi.
Bork would have been easier.
Look at the Houthi thing for a minute. It costs between $1 and $2 million for every missile that's fired at it,
And they double tap for every drone.
and they double tap. Right,
What's double tap?
two missiles per drone.
Okay.
Yeah, so one $30,000 Iranian drone flying at the ship, two
$2 million.
$2 million missiles. 30,000, 4 million.
But you would think someone would do the math
Bad math.
and say, well, maybe that's not the way to handle this.
So is it a hopeless cause to think we could rethink this? If we wanted to start with a fresh piece of paper here and say, what do we need, and who are the people to do it?
I
and
would
how do
have I would have a crash program to figure out how to deal with drones.
Okay, so that's the immediate tactical
Yeah, because
issue.
we don't have an answer to that.
A cheap way.
A cheap way, yeah, an effective way and cheap way.
Yeah. Look, as simple as a smart flak. Remember the Germans were shooting 88s and they were shooting at our aircraft over Germany at 20 and 25,000 feet, and they were hitting. Now with a 100 millimeter or a 60 or a 30 millimeter cannon, high velocity, you can have programmable bursting rounds, so you could knock that aircraft at even high altitude out.
I think
Quite
so.
cheaply.
I think that's a very valid point. I mean, years ago, I was the head of a company called Finmechanica,
Okay.
in North America, and which is a defense, defense company. And we had proposed a system of using the 76 millimeter gun.
Automalera. Yep.
Yeah, on a Malaria. Now, at the time, the Navy said, we don't want any guns anymore.
What?
We don't want any guns anymore.
Because they
We're
just want
going to have
missiles.
missiles.
Oh, God.
It's all going to be missiles.
And I
I
like
see, I
guns
see.
because people say lasers or directed energy. You know what? There's clouds, there's salt air.
And
what-
you can
what-
make,
what
and you
doesn't
can
affect
make
it?
guns very
Bullets.
smart now. Yeah. And they're cheap.
Exactly.
But they weren't interested. I mean, I sat right across from the guy. I mean, I can remember the meeting. He said, well, we're just not interested. We don't want guns anymore.
So this is the Bill Walton show, and I'm sort of slack-jawed here. I'm learning about a Navy that no longer thinks it needs guns. Here with Erik Prince and Stephen
Oh,
Bryen.
they're taking the guns off the Zumwalt. They took one off yesterday.
Well, the question I have for both of you, really, with this vast experience, it seems like when we're fighting wars now, there's just an unreality to this, a disconnect. I think of Lindsey Graham getting in front of a camera and talking about we're going to send people to do this or young men to do that, and it seems like, but you step back and nobody in Washington seems to have any skin in the game. I know, Eric, you wrote about this in your piece.
That's surrogate warfare.
Surrogate warfare.
Yeah.
And so we're really in this world where we think there's these costless decisions, and yet we send out people to fight and die, and we never really quite win because we're never committed to it. And
Well, you don't want us to be committed,
well,
committed to
but-
it right now. I mean,
well,
this
not,
is a
not,
very
not,
dangerous
not Ukraine.
situation. That's what
I'm talking about abstractly. I
Oh,
would
okay.
certainly not. I'm not talking about Ukraine. I'm thinking about the next adventure, and
There are
there
a lot of
will be
a lot of
the
people
next adventure.
trying
And
to
Eric,
get us into that war.
You know,
physically.
well, Eric writes something here. Says the reality is, the American Civil War, World War is the 20th century. Germany lost 5.3 million of 17.7 million men aged 15 to 44, 30% of their male population. And the brutality is this is the reality of winning wars.
That's right.
And we're not in that reality. We're not committing ourselves.
The whole premise of the GWAT was this over love of technology. And you just thought
GWAD, help me.
Global War on Terror.
Global War on Terror.
And they
okay.
thought that if you just remove the head, right, surgically remove the head of the snake, that the snake will wither and die. And that flies in the face of that 30% number you're talking about. You win by destroying the base of the pyramid, the manpower, the logistics, finance. This high-tech voyeurism that became finding the one guy to smack him clearly doesn't work. And that's why we had 20 years of war. If the a response after 9/11 was fully appropriate, it should have looked like a Scipio Africanus punitive raid, where Scipio Africanus was sent by the Roman Senate after Carthage had been raiding all through Rome. Remember, Hannibal marched elephants all the way across the Alps into Rome, killed a lot of people.
Almost won.
Almost won. And they sent Scipio Africanus, and he smashed Carthage, and it ended as a society, as a civilization, salted the fields, the whole thing. A punitive raid in Afghanistan would have been appropriate. Kill hundreds of thousands of Taliban and Al-Qaeda anywhere in Afghanistan, or even go to the tribal areas to say, do it again, and we're going to come back and do 5 times as many. They would have understood that. It would have been significantly cheaper in blood and treasure and toil on American lives and even in Afghan lives.
Well, I think that's true. I don't disagree. The problem is political. The problem is, would the American people support that kind of initiative, that kind of war?
In the first 6 months after 9/11, yes.
For
20 years later, no.
No. Yeah. I would think that's right.
But in terms of skin in the game, you write something that was striking. So after the Roman Empire lost a crushing defeat at the Battle of Cannae, Roman Senate immediately became 40% undermanned because the Roman leaders served in the defense of their republic, and they put on their battle dress, if you will, their tunics, and they went to war.
Right.
They personally were engaged in the battle.
And so we're now suffering the all-volunteer army, great in concept. But the fact is, you have 0.5% serving in the military, another 3 or 4% of the population that knows the 0.5%, leaving 95% of the military,
Wow.
of the population, with no clue, let alone no skin in the game, to live with the consequences of sending troops into half-assed battles and campaigns of never wars run by bureaucrats in Washington that don't have to live with the decisions. Fine. If you want to send lawyers and let them decide when they can drop a bomb, fine. Make the lawyers attach as riflemen to every unit first for the first 6 months of their deployment. Then you'll have better decisions from lawyers.
Well, decisions from lawyers.
Yeah, you might want to question that one.
We want to, but we were talking about this earlier that maybe the all volunteer army was a very bad idea because
I think it divorced the American people from the American army. Took the army out of America, essentially.
And the way that ended up, though, is fascinating because with the woke military now, what happened was we recruited young men who wanted to fight. There were a certain type person that was willing to go into battle and risk their lives and die for their country, and pretty attractive people. And now with the woke purges of the military, that requiring everybody to have a vaccine, doing this, sensitivity training, same as they're driving all those people who wanted to be warriors out of the business of being warriors.
I think that's right.
True.
I mean, we're ending up with nothing.
Well, my daughter served. She left the army as a lieutenant colonel. She had 2 tours in Iraq. And her view of it is pretty much what you say. I mean, it's very disappointing to them to see what's being done.
I can't imagine recruiting now, even for the SEALs. I mean, if you're going into that, the recruiting numbers are terrible because nobody wants to go in and subject themselves to all this.
And what did so Westmoreland was appearing before Congress after he screwed up in Vietnam, and then the Army made him the chief of staff of the Army. So typical. And he was debating against Milton Friedman in Congress over going to an all-volunteer force. And Westmoreland said, I don't want to lead an army of mercenaries. That's what he called an all-volunteer force, people that were paid a market wage for their service. And Friedman's answer was, well, sir, I don't want to, then I'm happy to be served by a mercenary butcher, barber, and accountant. He said, because if you're not getting paid a market wage, you're a slave.
Mm.
So interesting counter argument. So
Yeah.
again, and I hate to sound like the constant proponent of a contracted solution, but it is as old as warfare itself. And when the military repeatedly finds itself unable to do a job, something will fill that force. Either the enemy is going to fill it, or a contracted solution.
Or you lose.
Or you lose. Well, that's what I mean. The
Yeah,
enemy's
yeah.
the enemy's going to fill that space, and they're going to feed it to you at the end of a bayonet.
So, go ahead.
Well, I think there's, in a narrower sense, there's a war on terror. Let's call it that. Has, sometimes it's not exactly terror, but okay, it's a war on terror.
I never liked that
These
term.
are against,
I don't know what
essentially
terror
it's
is.
the war
really.
against third country threats.
Yeah.
And then you have the third country being defined as poorer, less capable countries, although if we get to Iran, it's not really the case. And then you have land wars like you're seeing in Ukraine, which are full-scale land wars. You look at that war, and you could take, if you put a little graininess in the pictures, it would look like World War II. I mean,
Exactly.
Yeah. And a little bit like World War I when you consider the
Trench warfare.
trenches, right. And we're not ready for that. We can't do that. There's a lot of, I want to get off on this because it's bothering me. There's a lot of talk about sending in NATO troops to Ukraine. Complete
Terrible.
lunatics. Because if there's a war in Europe, the first thing that's going to happen is we're going to lose it. We don't have the forces in Europe. American army is mostly an expeditionary army. It's not on our territory or near our territory. It's far away from our territory. So it's all expeditionary. All has to be fed from outside. So it's much smaller in terms of fighting force than you would have as a national land army facing another national land army. I just don't, I think it's a very grave danger that people think, Lindsey Graham being one of them, that it would be a good idea for us somehow engage in the land war.
It's just
in
another
Europe.
version. Lindsey Graham tells us we're going to fight till the very last Ukrainian dies.
Do you know what's the common amongst all these
Yeah.
European leaders that want to make those kind of decisions? They don't have children.
That's an
Macron,
interesting point.
no children.
Literally, no, they're child.
Merkel, no children.
Yeah.
Theresa May, no children. That ilk,
Yeah.
no children.
Or at
the-
least no children in
that-
the military,
No.
but no children at all.
Angela Merkel never had children. Macron married his mother. No children. Maybe she's 25 years older than him.
He does.
And that's fine. If people don't want to have children, fine. But you have a different perspective on intergenerational decision making if you don't have kids that are.
Well,
putting
but
on-
even if I'm not sure how far you can carry that sociological argument, but let's say it's valid. Fact of the matter is you still have to count. You still have to say how many,
math still matters.
math matters. How many troops do I have? What kind of equipment do I have? What kind of stockpiles do I have? Where are they located? What will happen if they're attacked? And these, I hate to say it, but these people are acting like morons. Aside from exposing their own countries to attack by Russia, and Russia being exposed to attack by, the U.S. has pretty good air power, so it would be an
Bill, that's
issue.
why I say in the article, all these people that are the measured response kind of people in Washington, I say, fine. they should have their children drafted and sent to frontline combat units so that they can live, so their families, their children can live with the decisions they're making.
Well, and keep in mind that the French
Yeah.
threats are not to send French citizens for the most part.
Legionnaires.
They're legionnaires, foreign legion
But the Legion is led by French,
officers.
native-born French officers.
That's right.
So that's not
But if you,
it's not all foreigners that they're sending.
Well, but we're wandering into very interesting territory here. We're talking about the culture, changing the culture, has badly infected our ability to wage a war effectively, and we're not willing to do what's necessary. So then the question is, we shouldn't be fighting these wars at all, or if we do it, we've got to do it to win, and we're not ready to do that. But then continue.
no, you've put your finger right on the dilemma, the problem.
No place for half measures.
So let's back up. We've been talking about conventional war, and I've got to get you guys. I'd keep you here all day, but you have other things. I can't believe you have other things to do besides talk with me
There
about
you go.
this. But anyway, that's. We've been talking about a conventional European war, World War I, World War II, conventional weapons. We haven't really talked about the nuclear piece of this, nuclear, and is that just. Where is that now? Where is that in the equation?
Well, the Russians just did a nuclear exercise because we did one. Look, I think the nuclear threat, I don't see any reason to use a nuclear weapon by either side for any reason at this point. And I'm not sure there's ever any reason, put it another way around, to use a nuclear weapon. This is such a destructive thing. And it only invites, if you have an enemy that doesn't have any, maybe you could get away with it. But the Russians have thousands of them.
But that's a rational leadership crew. I mean, what about the irrational leadership? What about an Iran that has
Or North Korea,
or
maybe.
North Korea? That,
Yeah.
I mean, you're talking about rational actors. And the thing about this Ukraine situation with Russia, I think Putin has actually shown more mature leadership of this and more responsible stewardship of the war than has the NATO
Well,
and
he
the
hasn't
United
wanted
States.
he doesn't want it to spread.
Yeah. Well, so he's
Yeah.
the adult. He's the adult in the room that we want.
Yeah. I mean, from that point of view, I think he's consistent, because there's been a lot of provocations from Russia's perspective that could have led him into a bigger war. The sinking of the Moskva, the attack on the Kerch Strait Bridge, just a few examples. The introduction of long-range ATACMS and Storm Shadow and Scalp and other missiles that can hit Russian territory have been all provocations from Russia's point of view, and he has not responded to those in a way that would widen the war. And I think that's kind of interesting.
Yeah, conventionally, it would be more difficult for the Russian army to take on hundreds of thousands of additional NATO troops that would be sent into the breach, but we don't need any kind of wider NATO war over Ukraine. That
Well,
is
and they have,
absolutely wrong.
Russians have about 500,000 soldiers on standby. So they would outnumber any NATO force that could actually be put together.
Before we get out of here, let's talk about China. Where's China and their military capabilities? I keep reading that they're building warships at 5 times the rate that we are, and that they've got a space warfare capability, which
We should send the Pentagon planners over there to help them.
You mentioned that the U.S. military is very expeditionary, and military power is about how much combat ability you can marshal at one point, at the Schwerpunkt, at the inflection point. And so for the U.S. military to try to say we're going to be dominant everywhere all the time,
Not possible.
not possible. And so as China builds more and more relative power concentrated very close to mainland China, to have the U.S. spread that much combat power that far from our shores, and especially my frustration with Pentagon leadership and planners and all the rest is they're so conventional in thinking that it seems like if it came to a conflict with China over Taiwan, the Pentagon would run its playbook and it would lose. And I don't care how many missiles we have to shoot down their missiles, they can produce lots more missiles.
Well, we've run those exercises,
And we
though, and
lose.
every time we lose.
Correct.
Yeah, but they're always closed games. I mean, it's only defending Taiwan. It's not beyond that.
Look, I think the only thing that you can credibly deter Taiwan with is a home guard, because it's the one thing that the CCP cannot calculate for. You know, if you think about the American Revolution, there was 30% that were pro-crown loyalists, 40% in the middle that didn't really care, 30% that were pro-liberty, but you only had 10% of the 30%, 3% of the population that actually fought in the War of Independence. If we trained up 3% of the Taiwanese population, the motivated police, firemen, civil defense people, the CrossFitters, the marathoners, the active part of the most interested part of their military. So that's 24,720,000 people. And you equip them with some basic weapons, some basic drones, some EFPs, some RPGs. That would be an incalculable force, very difficult, and 5 times as large as the Taiwanese armed forces already. I think that would give the CCP pause. Because if they're going to go, they have to go quickly. They cannot have a 2-year drawn-out battle to take Taiwan, because they could not sustain.
Their economy would crash.
Exactly.
Yeah, I agree with that.
And they're highly subject, requiring hydrocarbon imports and food even, all of which could be restricted. So,
Well, we've been not done well by the Taiwanese, to be honest.
no, democratizing force in Taiwan, letting the people have the means to defend themselves.
And
Okay.
it would require reform on the Taiwanese part too. Let's
Yes.
face it. They have a very old time style army.
Yeah.
And needs reform. Their best service is the Air Force, in my opinion.
And again, everything, every location, every airfield, every bunker, everything has been pre-registered for a Chinese CCP missile.
Oh yeah, that's
Or
why
probably
you,
5.
you need to use highways, and you need to have short takeoff and landing aircraft, which we denied them,
Or 700,000 people with guns.
and you need that too.
Because you can turn every village, every street corner, every urban area into a multi-layer bunker complex.
And we don't know how well the Chinese would fight.
So let's get
Exactly.
into the advice business here. Let's imagine that Trump wins. He's president. It's now January, February 2025, and we're advising Donald Trump on what to do with the military vis-a-vis China and Taiwan. What do you say?
Well, build up Taiwan. I think just
Okay,
I
the
think Eric's point is
homeland
yeah,
security.
that's part of it.
$1 billion spent in building a home guard properly and equipping it is way more effective than all the exotic weapons the Pentagon wants to sell.
Okay, and that's a drop in the bucket compared to where
Exactly.
we've toasted money elsewhere.
Oh yeah, it's chump change.
Okay, and do we have the technical? I would think there might be some private military contractors that could help them do that.
Cento per cento.
Well,
But there is a role here for somebody that actually understands how
Or you
this works to
send,
go
or
in-
you send 5,000 special forces trainers.
right.
Yes.
Well, that's the thing.
You don't
I
need
mean,
a contract. Just special ops
Yeah,
people could
I
do
mean,
that.
you don't
well.
have enough SOP guys
Okay.
to do that. So yes, of course there's,
Yeah, we've only just recently started to increase training of Taiwanese, and even there, very modestly. We went from 100, not even 100, maybe 50 trainers to 200 trainers. That's nothing.
Right.
I think Eric's point is well taken. We have to send the right trainers to Taiwan to teach them the tactics that they will need to do to stop a physical invasion of the island. It's not a small country, Taiwan.
very, very rugged terrain.
Very
well, and
rugged,
also
yes.
it's several hundred islands. I mean, aren't
Well,
some of the islands?
yeah, but the big one is
Formosa,
Okay.
the main
Formosa,
island is one that
okay.
matters.
Kinmen. They have the Paracels. They have some islands, but they're right against China. I mean,
Yeah, the close, like Quemoy and Matsu are within artillery range.
Quemoy is Kinmen.
Yeah.
And it's you can see
You could probably shoot a mortar.
you can see the Chinese cities on a
Yeah.
clear day from the island. I mean, it's
You can
that
swim
close.
it.
So those are
Swim.
not strategic necessarily to Taiwan. The main island, where the chip fabs, that's why we care.
Yeah.
90% of the chips made by Taiwan are the high end that are required in our economy, required in the cameras filming this conversation and the phones that people are watching it on.
And yeah, Taiwan semiconductors of little strategic importance to everyone.
Yep.
We need to keep that. All right. Well, final word here, Eric. I mean, there really is no final word. We really covered just the tip of what we ought to be covering. But one of the things you concluded your article with is that there is more of a role for the private sector in these solutions, and I'm biased to agree with that.
I take a historical perspective and I see what the private sector has played throughout the millennia and will do so in the future, regardless of how blockheaded people in Washington want to be, because they're going to figure it out one way or the other, whether it's in the last ounces of at their most desperate hour, they're going to figure it out. The private sector. Look, honestly, what stopped the initial invasion of Ukraine were average Ukrainians picking up guns and anti-tank missiles from the armory. That was the best decision the Ukrainian government made. It was they opened their weapons and said, here, come and take.
Mm-hmm.
And they did. And that's what stopped the initial push of the Russian army.
Well, I agree with that. I think that we need to find a way to bring real innovation into our defense thinking. And it's not going to come from the system, unfortunately, because the system responds to directives that come from DOD, from the Pentagon, that says, build this way. These are the requirements, meet the requirements. And then they always favor the big companies.
I think that's a pretty good blueprint. I think that'd be good advice. Trump would be receptive to that, and I think it covers the waterfront, including the higher tech things like space warfare. We get Elon Musk involved.
Well, think about it. I was born in the summer of 1969, summer of Woodstock and Apollo 11. And if you'd said then that 50 years later, the only way you get to the International Space Station is on a private contractor's rocket, they would have laughed you out of Johnson Space Center.
And now it's a reality.
And this idea of what is inherently governmental shifts with the ebb and flow of technology.
There's nothing that this government does that it can do better than the private sector. So that's my final word on this.
Look at his satellite communication system.
Yeah,
Starlink, spectacular.
It's spectacular. I mean, and the Pentagon didn't want it. Now they're doing it because they're embarrassed into it, and it works. But I think it's a piece of genius, and that's what we need, more genius.
Okay, we're going to stop because I like to get out of here on an optimistic note and a line of action, and we got both. And I forgot we've got to stop for an important update on technology and our security. And we have something in this box called a UP phone that I'm now the proud owner of.
Good.
So I'm a customer.
Welcome aboard.
Tell me about what's in this box.
So this resulted from a rage phone call 3.5 years ago after the 2020 election and seeing big tech cancel certain voices, certain apps, certain platforms. And I said, we're never going to make big tech better by complaining about it, only by competing. And so we put a team together and we built a phone completely independent of the Google and Apple universe. This is our hardware, our operating system with all our own code based on an Android kernel. The difference is this phone doesn't have an advertising ID. And so your phones, their advertising ID actively works with all the apps sitting on your phone to collect and harvest and export your data, where you go, what you buy, who you call, what you browse, turns the microphone on, turns the camera on, turns the GPS on. This phone doesn't. So this phone is all about protecting your First and Fourth Amendment rights, the right to free speech and the right to be free from illegal searches. And now with Congress having just passed this horrific, massive expansion of FISA, now any of the cell phone data that's out there, any of the stuff I talked about, now any federal agent can go to that company and order the company to turn it over without a warrant and without probable cause.
Okay, two things. I've got a phone I mostly hate. It's an iPhone,
Yep.
and it's got all these apps on it, that way too many apps. Does this allow me to control the amount of stuff that gets dumped onto this phone?
Yes, this is the first phone with actually a privacy center, which is a firewall, which allows you to hard off what is allowed to come off the phone.
Yeah.
And we have our own app
camera.
store.
Can we see that?
Yep.
Yeah, okay, good.
This phone also has a kill switch, which separates the battery from the electronics, so it physically air gaps it so
Because
that
this
when
you can't
off is
take
off.
the battery out
Exactly.
of
Your
anymore.
phone, you can't
No.
turn off.
It's on all the time.
And
Yeah,
this
I know,
phone
it
even
talks to
has
me in the middle of
this
the
even
night.
has a dump feature. So if someone says, "Bill, Mr. Walton, give me your phone. I'm here to search it." You say, "Sure, officer," and you can unlock it with a certain code, and it wipes the phone. This is the answer to an overreaching big tech, an unhealthy convergence of surveillance capitalism with Big Brother.
Okay, can I keep the phone number?
Yes,
So I've got a phone number for
Easy.
this. I can transport it over.
correct.
Now is this on? What's
You can
the
order
system?
it-
Is this on Verizon? Is this
you
what?
can,
What do you
you can
what,
use
what commer-
T-Mobile or AT&T. Verizon wants to nick us for another $500,000 to connect to their network. We have better things to do with $500,000. So
Okay, so I've
AT&T
got to
and
give up
T-Mobile for now.
Verizon. Now, what do I give up if I give up Verizon? If I keep
You
keep my
get better,
phone number?
You actually get better domestic and international coverage from either T-Mobile or AT&T.
Okay.
Yeah, because it uses the European standard for.
Yeah, it uses GSM instead of
Yeah.
Well,
CDM.
you had one of these phones. You said you bought one in Italy.
Well, I had-
isn't
I had
this
a-
manufactured
you
in Italy?
you would not have bought that in Italy. Those
No.
we did 500 units last fall, and then we just got 10,000 production units in last week.
I had a
So we're
company
shipping
called
today.
Fortress Phone that was a totally secure phone in the sense that you had to have another Fortress phone to talk, fully encrypted.
So if I wanted to I'd ordered another iPhone. I needed a bigger screen. I have aging eyes, and so this has a bigger screen, so that solves that problem. What am I going to lose if I give up the Verizon, except for
You're going to
Oh.
lose big tech. You're going to lose a digital proctology exam from big tech every day. I've talked to so many people, Bill, and they said, I was talking to my wife about needing a new mattress. And the next day, they're getting advertising for mattresses. Now, they didn't call about it. They didn't search about it
I
or
thought
send a message.
I thought your
They were
story,
talking, which means on your phone, not on an unplugged phone.
but I thought your story was the next day the mattress was delivered.
They just sent the bill. They sent the bill.
They just
Maybe
sent
so.
the bill. They already debited. They never debited your credit card. You're done, buddy. That is an issue. I mean, we notice this all the time. You have the random conversation, and next thing you know, it's it's fulfilling your every need.
An unplugged phone will not do that to you. So if you're sick of carrying Mark Zuckerberg around in your pocket or on your shoulder, listening to everything you're saying, get an unplugged phone.
So I've already got one. I do own this. Now, what am I going to there? If I go online on the internet and I read the reviews, people say, well, it's not really that secure because it's got to use the towers that are in place. And how do we? What do the
Here's the thing.
critics say about this?
We look, anything that emits electrons can eventually be tracked.
Yeah.
But-
Okay.
The fact is that we prevent the ad ID from exporting all of your data and you're just a sieve right now. We curtail about 98, 99% of that.
You have to get rid of Google Mail.
We don't have it.
No Google Mail.
No Google Mail. You can't use it because it's totally, everything you write on Google Mail belongs to them.
Look, Google is
Yeah, I don't use
such
Gmail.
a large and wealthy
Yeah.
company because it's an advertising company built
Yeah.
on the premise of they give you free stuff and they collect everything.
Well, how do you make money?
We sell the phone, so we make money on the phone.
So the hardware, you sell
Yep.
sell a piece of hardware,
and
you
at
get a margin on
month
that.
13, you pay us $12 a month for
Okay,
use
and
of
that's
our
a
operating system.
continuing fee.
Correct, and that includes use of our messenger, our VPN, antivirus, and the operating
So the
system.
first 12 months, that's free, and then
It's included in the price of the phone.
and
You
then
have
$900 $989. You can order at unplugged.com.
Do you have an email?
We Proton Mail is in our
Proton
store,
Mail. Okay.
and then we're doing a couple of other private label ones soon.
no, I'm using Microsoft Outlook phone email on this. Is this on
It'll
this?
work.
Is that
Browser-based
transportable
will
onto
work fine.
this?
Yep.
Okay, Maureen, what else should I be asking here? Is it easy to
Yes.
transfer it over? How long is it?
I transferred all my stuff over in like 3 minutes,
That's easy.
and we have good tech support that speaks English as a first language.
Where's your tech center?
It's in the U.S. somewhere. I've called it.
Okay, all right. So we get a good tech support.
Yes.
What else should I ask about this?
Well, no, it's an interesting
What did we
idea.
pay for this?
$989.
Okay.
comparable in speed, storage, camera quality to the high-end stuff of the other guys. But again, this one's not collecting and exporting all of your data.
Kenny, what else should I ask him here? Kenny's my tech. Camera features. Is this camera the same as the one on the new iPhone? Is this a high definition?
I think it's even made by the same manufacturer.
Okay, so we get the same high quality we get with the iPhone.
Where's the phone made?
Indonesia.
Indonesia.
Supply chain specifically selected to not come from China.
Well, Indonesia is growing quite nicely. That's the untold story about what's going on in the world. Indonesia, Malaysia, India, all those, that whole area of the world is growing nicely without a bit of help from us. Okay.
Thank you.
Do we have? Okay. Here's the number you dial. How do we?
Unplug.com.
Unplug.com, and I've already bought it, so I'm all in, and looking forward to it. And
I always thought you were a little unplugged, so that's fine.
I actually am a little unplugged. I'm a little unmoored. One of the girls in high school said, your head's in the clouds sometime, but my friend said, yeah, but his feet are on the ground.
Oh, there you go.
And that's sort of the way I operate.
Thank you, Bill.
Thank you, Stephen Bryen, Dr. Stephen Bryen, Erik Prince, great guys. Good to have you back. We solved most of the issues of the world, but not all of them. You'll be back until next time. Okay. Anyway, thanks for joining. As you know, you can find us on all the major podcast platforms and on CPAC Now on Monday nights. We've also got a great Substack page with the video and some other writings on it. And as always, get in touch. Let us know whether you like this and other shows that would help you learn about how the world works. So anyway, thanks for joining, and talk soon.